Hail and well met friends of Ultima and Wurm. This is the 9th part in a series of videos where I document the process of recreating the world of Ultima Online in Wurm Unlimited, the best RPG sandbox out there. Many of you in and out of YouTube have been showing your support and also asking when I'll do the next part. Thank you so much guys for cheering me on in this crazy adventure of mine, and a special shout out goes to Mootred, who is a much loved Wurm player and YouTuber. He has a great channel full of Wurm goodness, so be sure to go and check it out as well. Admittedly, it's been a while since the last video due to some real life things that got in the way, but I'm back on track now and committed to finishing this project. In the last episode we were building the beautiful city of Trinsic, but this time we've headed north to the wintry landscape of Dagger Isle, also known as Ice Isle. In the initial version of Ultima Online, this island was the only outside area on the map that was covered with snow, making it always a special place to visit. Although I never lived on Dagger Isle myself, I remember it was very popular among the rich and famous veteran players, since there were numerous spots to build castles and keeps on. Regardless, I did visit often, if for no other reason than to tame polar bears, or go hunting in Dungeon Deceit, or to go visit the Shrine of Honesty. As we fly over the island, what you see here has not yet been touched after first creating the server. It is completely generated from the grayscale height map I made, which forms the geometry of the island, and how I mapped the biomes in the map generator application. I have to say that it looks pretty darn good and accurate, regardless. The first impression is that there's not anything I really need to do, aside a little bit of terraforming and tunneling into the mountain to make Dungeon Deceit. But as I've discovered working on this project, nothing is ever easy, and each new town or area that I work on challenges me with new and unexpected things to solve. So first problem. As I lined up the dungeon map with the island, I realized that realistically, the dungeon would never fit inside the mountain. In fact, it would not even fit on the whole island. One could of course imagine that the dungeon goes so deep into the ground that it lays beneath the seabed. However, that is not the experience you have walking into the dungeon from the outside. The entrance is on the same level and goes only one floor down with each of the 3 sections. And even if it did go down that deep, it would not be feasible to make in Wurm, since if you tunneled so low, you'd soon be swimming in the sea water. The second problem was the height of the bedrock. In Wurm, to be able to make tunnels, you need solid rock, and considering the dungeon is 3 stories high, it would either require the base of the island to be very high in order to accommodate the dungeon beneath the surface, or else the dungeon would need to be scaled down enough so that it fits within the mountain. But scaling it down would not be a good option either, since the layout and details of the dungeon would be lost. Each square in this grid represents 1 Wurm tile, so for instance in the case of the prison cells, one would want the prison to be at least 3 tiles wide at the very minimum, so you could get a hallway and prison cells on either side. By default, this would be a perfect fit using the original scale, but by shrinking it down, all you'd be left with is a long 1 tile wide hallway. So, it was important for me to stick to the original and correct scale. I would have to find other ways to compromise to make this work. I spent quite some time trying to figure out how to solve this, and in the end the best solution I could come up with was to move the location of the dungeon so that it would be placed pretty much in the center of the mountain. Even if the outer extremities of the dungeon wouldn't fit within the mountain, the nearby ground could be terraformed high enough to still allow for the ground to slope naturally towards the shore, unlike this option. The new dungeon location would also require me to change the pathway a bit and the entrance to the small neighboring cave. In the end, this option felt like the best way to keep the original layout of the dungeon, to ensure that the island would have a natural shape and yet retain some sense of authentic experience when discovering it. Without much of a plan, the first thing I started doing was raising the bedrock so I could make sure the mountain had high enough rock to tunnel into. At this point I had not even checked the dungeon layout in UO yet, so I didn't yet realize that the dungeon doesn't even fit inside. But I soon realized the truth of the matter, and after sorting out the new location of the dungeon and mapping it on the tiles, I realized that it was hard to keep track because the terrain tiles would change to rock or dirt if I had to modify the geometry. So I started all over by flattening pretty much the whole mountain to get a better bird's eye view so I could compare the tiles to my grid in Photoshop. And also, to make a much more secure way of marking the dungeon areas, I replaced the tile textures with pieces of furniture that I could color code to keep track of the various areas. This would prove to be the best way to mark the land and was of great help all the way to the end. Eventually, I was back on track with a proper plan this time, and once everything was planned out, I quickly raised up the mountain tiles again. The lower half being solid bedrock to accommodate the dungeon tunnels, and the upper half being dirt, so it would still be easy to terraform and turn this big ugly block back into a sloped mountainside. It was finally time to start tunneling into the new solid rock mountain and make the entrance to Dungeon Deceit. The dungeon was going to take a long time to make and would go very deep, so adding some temporary torches along the way would help me greatly in keeping track of things. At this point I had tunneled through the entire dungeon map all the way to the end, and to celebrate I decided to decorate the final room to make it look as similar as possible to the UO version. The problem with making something look like a dungeon in Wurm, though, is that Wurm doesn't naturally have dungeons per se. Instead, players can mine tunnels and monsters will naturally spawn inside them over time. However, you'd never find actual dungeons in Wurm, complete with things like skeletons, chests, decaying furniture and such. And this means that even though Wurm has a huge selection of items players can decorate with, there are unfortunately not any proper dungeon items. Of course, the Wurm devs could decide to make such items if for no other reason than to give players cool things to decorate with. However, this would also require all of those items to have an actual purpose and functionality. You see, as this is one of the fundamental pillars of Wurm, that everything you can see and touch has some interaction and purpose tied to it. I guess if they really wanted to find some use for them, dungeon decorations could at least be disassembled or harvested for raw materials. Something for the dev team to consider, because I think a lot of players would love to decorate their mining tunnels to look like dungeons, especially now that we have the possibility to build underground dwellings. And speaking of that, the next thing we need to do is to start building walls, doors, and archways inside the tunnel. And let's not forget the dividing walls of the bigger rooms. Without the possibility to build underground, something that was added to the game only in recent times, this dungeon would have never been possible to make. We've now come to the point where the entire dungeon structure is complete with all the walls, doors, arches, and so on. But other than the last room, I have not yet started to decorate, because there is a very real risk that now when I begin terraforming the mountain slopes above, I might just mess up and destroy the tunnels below somehow. So before decorating, let's move on to terraforming the outside for a change. Up till now, these fences have marked the outer edges of the mountain, exactly how they are mapped out in Ultima Online, but now I can start removing them as I begin terraforming the geometry of the slopes. At some point I realized that to properly see the shape of the geometry, I should use the tiled floor texture. This really helped me get a grip on how to reshape the rock. I had a big problem though. As I dug away at the dirt, my inventory filled up with thousands upon thousands of pieces of dirt, and I couldn't figure out a practical way to get rid of it. Deleting them one by one from my inventory would take forever, and filling bulk storage bins and then deleting those was a pain as well, since they only hold 800-something pieces of dirt. So, as usual, upon asking about this on the forums, Bidoo came to my rescue and explained how to remove them through the database. I'm not going to go into that here, but if you're a Wurm modder interested in how to manually delete items from your server, I'll include the link to his instructions in the description below. Just to give some perspective of before and after terraforming, let's have a quick look at the mountain to see the change so far. As mentioned before, each of these episodes has posed me with new challenges and opportunities to learn new things. I've tried to remember to share those with you guys as well. So in this episode, I'll show you how to convert land into pure bedrock. Thanks again to Retro for explaining how to do this in the forums. In this case, I'm going to make the little cave on the eastern side of the island. The tool we'll be using is for creating focus zones, and in the case of making rock, the first thing you need to be aware of is that the rock will be created at the height of the tile you are standing on. So the first step is to terraform the area to the desired height. Next, stand on the tile, activate your ebony wand, target that same wand, select server, and choose focus zone. From the drop-down, choose flatten rock. Give the area a name with at least 3 letters and press send. You can also choose how many tiles you want to affect, but here I'm doing it carefully bit by bit since the dungeon tunnels are nearby, so I'm just leaving it at 0. And that's basically it. Getting back to terraforming, at some point I decided to temporarily change the stone slab texture to an even simpler design, so that the only detail you could see was the edges of the tiles. This made things even easier to see. It really gives you a clear idea of how Wurm's tiling system works. When you see the landscape like this, it's surprising to realize just how large each tile of the grid is in the end. Who knew you could achieve such organic and natural shapes in the landscape geometry with the grid being this big and sparse? At this point, we're pretty much finished with the mountains themselves, and although they're not quite as pretty as the map-generated versions we saw in the beginning of this video, I think I still managed to make them quite nice. The next thing to do is to terraform the flatter base land of the island and add some final touches. In UO, I mapped out all the lumps, bumps, ponds, and other special spots and made sure I made something similar here as well. Finally, after all of the terraforming, it's time to change the terrain type back to snow and rock. So satisfying to do. Although Dagger Isle is cold and icy, there is one spot where things have gotten hot and heavy back in the day, as it was the chosen location for a very special date. Some of you UO players out there might recognize this weird little hump of ice with a cave in it. Yes, it's the one on the northwestern part of the island. Back when I first started playing UO, my character Katsienna met and fell for a gentleman called Willie Tuff. Willie was a highly respected Sosarian on the Europashard, well known for his museum of rare artifacts and for his dealings with other role-players. I guess you could say he was the one who introduced me to role-playing in MMOs. Anyhow, with each date he'd take Katsienna on, he'd hunt out some amazing location beforehand, decorate it, then portal her in to a surprise dinner, gifts, and a waterbed. His instant waterbeds were an ongoing joke in our dates. Regardless of where we were, he somehow managed to always build one. Needless to say, Katsienna was very impressed indeed. That was the magic of Ultima Online. And Willie, if you ever happen to stumble upon this video, thank you for making my first years in UO so fun and special. Now, let's fast forward to the point where the entire island has been completed. I had already finished terraforming the geometry, I had decorated the whole dungeon, and I had spawned mobs and animals onto the island. It was ready for the final tour to begin. But just as I was doing some last-minute checks, I realized that lots of walls had been bashed in the dungeon. And sure enough, I discovered on Wurmpedia that all of the humanoid mobs and anything that was so-called unique would bash in walls and doors. So at this point I had to log off and go digging into the database to delete all such creatures from the server, then go back in and fix the structures and spawn in some new mobs that were not of the bashing kind. Again, another lesson learned the hard way. The most unfortunate aspect of this was that it would make it impossible for me to make areas that normally had dragons, such as the Fire Temple on Fire Isle, a walled-in place inhabited by lots of dragons. I wonder if there is a way to turn off the wall-bashing future of mobs in Wurm Unlimited. Alright, now we're finally done with the entire island and it's finished. So, let's have a final grand tour, shall we? As you can see, there are polar bears. Wurm doesn't have any polar bears, so I modified the brown bear skin. I mean, Dagger Isle simply wouldn't be the same without these guys. The Shrine of Honesty. Since there is only a limited amount of textures I can replace in the game, I decided to make a generic shrine tile with the symbol of the Ankh. It would just have to do, since I don't have the coding skills to add new textures. I only know how to modify old ones, but I think it still does a pretty decent job. And here it is, the pathway to dungeon deceit. Some of these rooms will look nothing like the original, due to just not having those elements in Wurm to work with, so some areas just had to be improvised. I've also added some warning signs throughout the dungeon to give an element of danger. As you saw, there were pointing signs as well. I decided to add a few of those to guide players along the way, since getting lost in a dungeon in Wurm is much more distressing than in UO, due to the fact that it's a first-person view, and it's very easy to lose your bearings. In UO, however, navigation of a complicated tunnel system is much less confusing, since the view stays static due to it being an isometric game. Here are those dungeon cells I talked about earlier. Seeing this now, I am so glad I did not compromise the size and layout of the dungeon. The structure of the dungeon is pretty much exactly like Dungeon Deceit as far as layout is concerned. Also, wherever you would see single or double doors or arched walls, I built them in exactly the same spots. As for lighting, I tried to mimic the colors of the lights in the same way as they are in UO. In a lot of these rooms, you'll see treasure chests. It's an item you can spawn in Wurm Unlimited, but I have absolutely no idea whether they will stay there or decay by the time this server opens to the public. I also don't know what they're used for in Wurm normally, but they sure make great decorations for this dungeon. I hope they stay. Same question goes for these skeletons, which I spawned as mobs and which fell to the ground immediately upon spawning. I wonder if they will decay later. It would be a shame if they did, as they do a fantastic job at making this feel like a real dungeon. That concludes our tour of Dagger Isle. It's been one of the more tedious parts of the project so far, but in the end, I think it turned out quite nicely. In the very least, it will offer a completely fresh and different experience for those adventurers who dare to sail here once the server is open. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I hope it was worth the long wait. After all of this cold, snow, and ice, I think it's time for a holiday in a hot and sunny place. So next time we shall sail south to the desert island of Nujel'm. See you there.